A global cultural treaty can influence whether a tax incentive works in practice. Not directly, not through binding fiscal rules, but structurally, at the level of design, access, and policy coherence. And most professionals, including very experienced ones, completely ignore it. I am Evelise Carvalho Ribas, and after more than 20 years working with tax incentives, governance systems, and cross-border cultural projects, this is one of those layers that quietly explains a lot of what professionals mistake for non-compliance with international obligations and for administrative friction. When professionals analyze cultural tax incentives, the analysis is usually the same. Domestic law, European law where relevant, occasionally bilateral treaties, but almost no one asks, what about international cultural commitments? And yet, more than 150 countries have ratified the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, a legally binding treaty focused on cultural diversity, international cooperation, and support for cultural operators across borders. So, if that many countries have committed to cultural cooperation at a global level, why is cross-border access to cultural incentives still so systematically difficult? That is where things get interesting. On paper, the convention is genuinely ambitious, support cultural diversity, encourage international collaboration, provide preferential treatment for developing countries, enable cultural operators to participate across borders. So, in theory, cultural tax incentives should reflect those commitments. In practice, they often don't. And the gap between what countries committed to and how their incentive systems actually operate is not a minor inconsistency. It is a structural constraint that affects operators every single day. Across different countries, the same pattern appeared repeatedly. Countries ratifying the convention. They design cultural incentives. They publish statements about supporting cultural diversity and international cooperation. Then, a foreign cultural operator from another country, from different cultural tradition, sometimes from a developing country, tries to assess the incentive. And everything becomes complicated, not explicitly restrictive. There's no rule that says foreign operators not welcome. But the criteria narrow in practice. Definitions of eligible activity become unclear. Procedures weren't designed for foreign documentation. Foreign entities are treated as non-equivalent, without any transparent basis for that determination. Access disappears quietly, not through prohibition, through design that was never really open. And here's what needs to be said directly. The UNESCO Convention does not regulate tax systems. It does not create enforceable fiscal rights. It does not guarantee access to any specific incentive. What it does is establish principles, not mechanisms, which means everything depends on integration. Is the convention reflected in national law? Is it embedded in administrative practice? Is it aligned with European frameworks or other supranational obligations? If not, it remains symbolic, well-intentioned, and largely dormant. This is exactly where structural and fiscal access constraints emerge in the cultural space. You have an international commitment on one side. You have a domestic incentive system on the other. And between them, no operational pathway. The incentive exists. The commitment exists. The legal basis for access exists, but the system was never designed to make that access real. Let me make this specific. A country has ratified the UNESCO 2005 Convention. It has a cultural tax incentive supporting production. It publicly promotes cultural diversity. To assess the incentive, organizations must be recognized national cultural entities or demonstrate equivalent status from abroad. Sounds reasonable until you try to do it from another country. Because now, legal definitions of cultural organization don't translate across legal systems. Required documentation doesn't have obvious equivalents in foreign administrative traditions. What counts as equivalent status is determined informally by an authority with no published criteria. The process is opaque enough that most foreign operators, especially those from developing countries, abandon it early. They are not excluded by any explicit rule. They are excluded because the system was designed for domestic operators and never adapted for anyone else. This is not exceptional. It is the norm. And here's the most overlooked part of the convention. It explicitly provides for preferential treatment for cultural operators from developing countries. In theory, tax incentives could be one mechanism for implementing that commitment, facilitating market entry, supporting genuine cultural exchange across significant economic asymmetries. But in practice, this is almost never implemented, not because countries are acting bad faith, because the normative, administrative, and institutional constraints I described earlier make even neutral access difficult. And let alone preferential treatment. The commitment exists on paper, but the operational architecture to deliver it does not. In Europe, this becomes more complex and more interesting because now you have two sets of commitments pulling in different directions. UNESCO says, support cultural diversity, encourage international cooperation, provide preferential treatment where appropriate. European law says, no discrimination, free movement applies, state aid must be controlled and uniformly accessible. These don't always align easily, and governments, often without explicit guidance on how to navigate that tension, default to a familiar solution: neutrality. Treat everyone the same. Design for non-discrimination, avoid anything that looks like preferential treatment, which sounds principled. But neutrality applied to unequal starting conditions doesn't produce equal outcomes. It reproduces inequality. And the UNESCO commitments that were supposed to address that structural asymmetry go unimplemented, not because of opposition, but because no one designed a compliant way to deliver them. In practice, I see at least two problems here. The first is poor design. A country tries to implement the spirit of the convention, but it uses nationality criteria or explicit preferential rules that create direct incompatibility with European non-discrimination principles. The intent is legitimate. The design is flawed. The result is a scheme that either gets challenged or quietly abandoned. The second problem is no integration at all. The country ratifies the convention, designs its cultural incentives, but creates no mechanism for preferential treatment, builds no administrative pathway for foreign operators. The commitment exists. The incentive exists. They were never connected. And the convention quietly collects dust while cross-border access remains broken. Professionals often ask whether the convention is actually powerful. The honest answer, powerful in principle, weak in execution, because it relies on political will, diplomatic cooperation, and voluntary implementation, not enforcement mechanisms. There is no court that enforces the convention's cultural commitments the way the Court of Justice enforces European law, for example. But that doesn't make it irrelevant. It makes it a strategic layer, not a legal weapon. The shift professionals needed to make is this. Don't approach the convention as a rulebook, as something that either applies or doesn't. Approach it as a diagnostic tool. It tells you what countries committed to. It tells you where policy should logically be reading. It tells you where the gap between commitment and implementation is widest, and therefore where the structural misalignments are. And if you can map that gap precisely, you can do something most professionals can't. Explain not just that access is failing, but exactly why and what a coherent solution would look like. For professionals working in this space, this is a genuine differentiator. You can identify gaps between international commitments and domestic implementation. You can explain access failures as a systemic level, not just as administrative friction. You can design cross-border structures that account for these constraints rather than simply encountering them. For institutions and policymakers, this is equally important. Tax policy, cultural policy, and international commitments are typically designed in separate departments, by separate teams, on separate timelines, but they operate together in the same system. And when they don't align, access breaks, commitments go unfulfilled, and the legal and reputational risk quietly accumulate. The UNESCO Convention doesn't give you incentives, but it tells you whether your system is coherent or whether it is making commitments on paper that the architecture was never designed to deliver. And if you ignore it, you are working with an incomplete map. You can still advise, you can still structure, you can still operate, but you will keep encountering friction you can't fully explain. And the professionals who can explain it, who can see the full architecture, operate at a different level. If you are just exploring this topic, the free research papers and visual frameworks are the right starting point. They map the architecture, how national law, European frameworks, and international commitments interact, and where access typically breaks down.